Madam President.
The Senate Majority Leader.
So this Thursday, President Biden will release the third budget proposal of his presidency, one of the most important chances all year to emphasize the contrast between Democrats' and Republicans' vision for the country. When Americans see President Biden's budget proposal and compare it to the nasty plans coming from Republicans, the contrast will be glaring and unmistakable. First, President Biden's budget will focus on creating opportunity for average Americans. He'll keep his promise not to raise taxes for anyone making less than $400,000 a year. He will show how Democrats will keep Medicare solvent for another 2 decades. And he'll lay out a plan, a realistic, serious plan, for lowering the deficit by $2 trillion over the next 10 years. Republicans love to talk about cutting the deficit, but Democrats have actually done it. The Inflation Reduction Act lowered the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars, and we cut the deficit while also cutting prescription drug costs and expanding tax credits for millions of middle-class families. Now compare President Biden's budget to the nasty vision laid out by our Republican friends. While the president's budget will keep taxes and costs low for the vast majority of families, Republicans went on record wanting to raise taxes by 30% for millions of Americans through their recent national sales tax proposal. While the president promised no new taxes for people making under $400,000, the very first bill House Republicans passed helped rich tax cheats get away with paying little or nothing in taxes. And while President Biden and Democrats have been clear Social Security and Medicare are not on the table, Republicans have proposed raising the retirement age and privatizing certain elements of Medicare. The result, fewer benefits for retirees, higher premiums for Medicare beneficiaries. We cannot overlook the threat Republicans also pose to Medicaid, which tens of millions of middle-class Americans rely on to ease the burden of paying for nursing homes and assisted living. Democrats want to preserve and strengthen Medicaid, but Republican proposals would cut Medicaid by $2.2 trillion and end coverage for millions of Americans. That average middle-class family, let's say they're 40, 50 years old, they're worried about paying for the kids' college, but they also have a parent in a nursing home. Right now, Medicaid would pay for it if the parent doesn't have the resources. These cuts, that burden will fall on tens of millions of American families in the prime of life. Finally, the president will make clear that in order to strengthen Social Security and Medicare and to lower the deficit responsibly, the ultra-rich must pay their fair share. There is no conceivable scenario where wealthy CEOs should ever pay a lower rate than nurses and teachers and firefighters. But that's precisely how Republicans preferred it when they cut taxes for the ultra-rich under Donald Trump. It's as if Republicans care more about making sure the rich stay rich than they do about building ladders to the middle class, than they do about keeping middle-class people in that position. Now, when President Biden called out Republicans for targeting Social Security and Medicare, they erupted with feigned outrage during his State of the Union. But to this day, Speaker McCarthy, House Republican leadership, have failed to present their own plan to the American people. Speaker McCarthy, it's now March 6th. Where is your plan? Speaker McCarthy, where is your plan? The president's about to release his budget. Are you going to release yours anytime soon? Enough with the dodging, enough with the excuses. Show us your plan, and then show us how it's going to get 218 votes on your side of the aisle. Americans deserve to see for themselves what Democrats and Republicans propose for the future of the country. Republicans should come clean with the American people about what cuts they're pushing and explain how those cuts will cause unnecessary pain for millions of Americans across the country. Now on rail safety. It's a busy time for the Senate as we get to the bottom of what went wrong last month in East Palestine. Last week, my colleagues, Senator Brown, Democrat, Senator Vance, Republican, introduced the Bipartisan Railway Safety Act of 2023. I promised to work with them and with colleagues on both sides to push this bill forward. This Thursday, the Environmental and Public Works Committee, under the able leadership of Chairman Carper, We'll also hear from Norfolk Southern's CEO, Alan Shaw. I expect a candid, honest, clear-eyed discussion about how we can prevent another East Palestine in the future. And while I'm glad that Norfolk Southern CEO is testifying, we cannot have an open debate, an honest debate in Congress about rail safety unless Republicans acknowledge how they spent years opposing safety rules intended to prevent accidents similar to the one in Ohio. The story of rail safety deregulation over the last decade has been a disturbing tale of Republicans placing profits over people and currying favor with the rail lobby, all at the expense of workers' and families' safety. As far back as the Obama administration, Republicans pushed numerous bills to weaken environmental standards, delay safety upgrades, and even prohibit federal funding for Amtrak. Under President Trump's watch, it became easier to transport flammable liquids and hazardous materials without proper oversight. Under President Trump's watch, it also became easier to cut back on staffing requirements while operating a train. And it was the Trump administration that killed proposals to expand electronic brake requirements across the industry. The reason for that delay? The Trump administration thought it was, quote, not economically justified. You can't come up with a better slogan for Republicans' attitude towards rail safety than this: not economically justified. I imagine the message that sends to small towns across America like East Palestine, with rail lines running right through them. I want to be clear. A full investigation into the cause of the East Palestine derailment must be complete before we know the specifics behind the accident. But it doesn't take an expert to see that if you spend years trying to cut back safety regulations, if you spend years doing the bidding of the rail lobby, then in the long run, communities like East Palestine are at greater risk of accident. And so are so many of my communities in upstate New York, where two of the major national rail lines run through the state, one across the center of the state, near where the Erie Canal ran, going through Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Albany, down the Hudson River, and the other across the southern tier. In fact, now, this weekend, we saw yet another Norfolk Southern derailment in Ohio, near Springfield. Thank God nobody was hurt. So I look forward to hearing from Norfolk Southern CEO this week. I look forward to working with both sides to increase rail safety through legislation. But Republicans need to acknowledge that accidents like the one in East Palestine don't happen out of the blue. They become more likely when maximizing profits is crowned king above everything else, even above people's safety. On the IRS Commissioner, today I'm going to file cloture on the nomination of Daniel Werfel to serve as Commissioner for the IRS. For the information of all senators, this will set up the first procedural vote on this nominee as early as Wednesday. Mr. Werfel was reported out of the committee with bipartisan support, and it should be no different on the Senate floor. Confirming someone as qualified as Mr. Werfel as IRS Commissioner is crucial to making sure Americans take full advantage of all the tax credits we approved last year through legislation like the CHIPS and Science bill. It's also crucial for deploying resources we approved to go after rich cheats and ensure middle-class families are not needlessly audited while those at the top get by scot-free. The Senate has a responsibility to make sure the IRS is fully staffed, to handle its enormous workload, all the more important this year because of the new tax credits we approved through bills like CHIPS and Science last Congress. And finally, on spectrum, Madam President, senators from both sides of the aisle are working to approve a 60-day extension of the FCC's spectrum auction authority by the March 9th deadline. The House recently passed a 60-day extension by voice vote. We are working right now to get the Senate to act quickly in order to give both sides more time to arrive at a larger comprehensive agreement. Congress has never before allowed the FCC spectrum auction authority to lapse, and to let it happen for the first time would be disastrous. Spectrum is essential for building out 5G capabilities. Its application impacts everything, from families' internet access to satellite communications all the way down to baby monitors. I expect both sides will come to an agreement very soon to approve a 60-day extension before the March 9th deadline. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.